A billionaire venture capitalist finds a child's crayon drawing hidden in his leather folio, a sloppy, innocent picture that shatters everything he thought he knew about his fiancée and her son. One small phrase, "me and my two dads," unravels secrets buried for years, revealing a hidden father and a truth no one dared to speak aloud. Instead of destroying them, this single drawing sparks a journey of courage, reconciliation, and radical love. What starts as a private betrayal transforms into a breathtaking redefinition of family you'll never forget. The conference room buzzed with quiet urgency. Behind the polished glass walls of Ardent Ventures, the Monday morning meeting was in full swing. Charts glowed on the massive screen at the head of the table, voices traded data across sleek surfaces, and assistants moved like clockwork shadows behind their executives. At the center sat Carter Wynn, CEO, venture capitalist, and the kind of man who could raise $30 million in funding before his second espresso. He didn't need to raise money anymore, not really. At 37, Carter was already one of the youngest billionaires on the East Coast. His reputation, precision, performance, no time for sentiment, preceded him in every boardroom. And yet this morning, his thoughts weren't on venture returns or emerging markets. They were on a drawing. It was still tucked inside his leather folio, protected like something far more fragile than crayon on printer paper. He hadn't told anyone, not his assistant, not his fiancée, not the press who would devour it if they ever got their hands on it. He wasn't sure why it had shaken him so much, but it had. The meeting ended. Carter nodded once, stood, and left without his usual final word. He rode the elevator down to his office on the 34th floor, barely registering the city skyline blazing gold beyond the glass. His assistant looked up from her desk as he passed. "Push back my 11 a.m. with Rothman," he said. "Tell them I'll call later." "Should I?" "No." He closed the door behind him. Only then did he pull out the drawing. It was innocent, bright, sloppy in the way all 6-year-old art was. He recognized the handwriting, "To Mr. Carter, from Mason." A stick-figure version of Carter stood on one side, hair slicked back, arms impossibly long. Next to him, 2 other figures, a boy in the middle, Mason, obviously, and 2 adults beside him. The text below read, "Me and my 2 dads." Carter had stared at that drawing for hours last night, long after Mason had gone to bed, long after Lila, his fiancée, had curled up beside him on the couch with wine and a smile. He hadn't asked her about it, couldn't, not yet, because something in it didn't line up, because as far as he knew, Mason only had one father, Lila's late husband, Caleb, a man Carter had seen in photos, heard referenced in soft tones, a man who had died 4 years ago. Cancer, Lila had said. They didn't talk about him often. Lila was private, always had been. Carter never pushed. Their relationship had grown quickly, naturally. Mason adored him, called him Mr. Carter at first, now Carter, with the occasional dad, when he thought no one was listening. Carter had fallen hard for both of them. He wasn't the marrying type, not before Lila. But she made life feel less like a negotiation and more like something worth surrendering to, which was why the drawing unsettled him. Because Mason hadn't drawn Carter and Caleb, he'd drawn Carter and someone else, someone Carter didn't recognize. And when he asked Mason who the second dad was, the boy had shrugged and said, "He lives in pictures." That was all. Now Carter sat at his desk, the drawing in front of him, the silence of his office a hum in his ears. He picked up his phone, dialed the number he'd never used before, the private investigator his security chief once recommended for background vetting. He'd never had a reason to use him. Until now. "Grant speaking," came the voice. "This is Carter Wynn. I need you to look into someone." Grant didn't hesitate. "Name?" "Lila Arden." A pause. "Your fiancée?" "Yes." Grant's voice was neutral. "And what exactly are we looking for?" "I don't know," Carter said. "That's the problem." He ended the call, folded the drawing again, and stared out the window, not at the city, but at his own reflection, faint in the glass. Two dads, pictures, questions he wasn't sure he wanted the answers to. He'd built his entire life on facts, on clarity, on certainty. But the child he'd grown to love like a son had handed him a folded page and, unknowingly, cracked something open. A truth Carter could feel pressing just beneath the surface of Lila's perfect smile, her careful pauses, the way she always changed the subject when he asked about Mason's early years. He thought he knew everything, but now he was beginning to wonder, had Lila ever told him the whole story? And if she hadn't, why? Carter didn't sleep that night. He lay beside Lila in their bedroom, staring at the ceiling while the sound of rain tapped against the windows like fingers seeking attention. Lila breathed steadily beside him, one hand curled against her chest, her engagement ring glinting faintly under the dim hallway light spilling through the cracked door. He looked at her face, so familiar now, so beautiful it still startled him sometimes, but all he could see was what he didn't know. Two dads. What did it mean? What had she not told him? And why did it feel like betrayal, even if she hadn't said anything untrue? He hadn't asked her yet. Couldn't. Not without more than a child's crayon drawing and an unsettled feeling. At 3:17 a.m., his phone vibrated on the nightstand. A message from Grant. One file. 2 lines. Subject, Lila Arden. Interviewed and lived with Dominic Reyes, 2016 to 2018. Carter's breath caught. Reyes. The name was unfamiliar. He sat up slowly, sliding from bed without waking Lila, and padded down the hallway to his office. The glow of the screen lit his face as he pulled up the attached file. Dominic Reyes. Photo, mid-30s, olive skin, kind eyes. Background, social worker, LGBTQ+ youth advocate. Had once worked in Denver around the same time Lila lived there. He had no criminal record. Quiet life. Unmarried. Attached was a photo from an old charity newsletter. Lila stood beside Dominic, smiling wide, one arm around Mason, who was barely a toddler then. And then came the line that stopped Carter cold. Reyes filed for joint guardianship of Mason in 2018. Application withdrawn 3 months later. No public statement given. He read it again, then again. Joint guardianship, not as a social worker, not as a friend, as a parent. Carter stared at the screen, his heart pounding like something had torn open and flooded through every assumption he had built his life on. Mason had drawn 2 dads, and maybe he hadn't been talking about Carter or Caleb. Maybe he was remembering something Carter had never known, someone he had never met. He shut the laptop and rested his forehead against his fists. Why hadn't she told him? Why hide something so fundamental? He returned to bed just before sunrise, laying stiff beside the woman he'd promised to spend his life with. But now, he wasn't sure which version of her he'd really been in love with. The next day, over breakfast, he watched Mason play with his juice box at the table, swinging his legs against the chair. Lila stood at the counter, pouring coffee, humming quietly. Carter asked casually, "Hey, buddy, what did you mean in your drawing when you said you have 2 dads?" Mason didn't hesitate. "You and Dom," he said. Lila froze. The silence between them went sharp like glass. Carter set his fork down slowly. "Dom?" he said carefully, keeping his voice even. "Who's Dom?" Lila turned around. Her face had gone pale. "We can talk about this later." "I think we should talk now." Mason looked between them, confused. "Dom was my other dad," he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Before we moved here." Carter looked at Lila. She set the coffee pot down and nodded toward the hallway. "Let's talk privately." They walked into the study. She closed the door behind them. Carter stood with arms crossed, feeling more like a stranger in his own home than he ever had before. "Tell me," he said. "Everything." Lila leaned against the edge of the desk, her eyes already full of sorrow. "I wasn't trying to hide it. Didn't know how to tell you without making it sound like I'd lived a double life. So who is he? Carter's voice was tight. Who is Dominic Reyes? Lila inhaled slowly. He's not just someone I dated. He's someone who loved Mason like his own. Because he was. For a long time. You told me Caleb was Mason's only dad. Caleb was his biological father, she said. But he died when Mason was only 2. We were barely surviving. I didn't know what I was doing, Carter. I moved to Denver to start over. Mason was just a baby. And Dominic? He was my friend at first, then more. But the thing is, he stepped in. He showed up. Every bath, every tantrum, every night, Mason woke up crying. I didn't ask him to. He just did. She paused. Her voice softened. And Mason called him Daddy before he even called me Mommy. Carter's throat tightened. But then why isn't he here now? Why haven't I ever heard his name? Lila looked down. Because I ran. The room felt like it shifted under his feet. He applied for joint guardianship, Carter said, voice low. Why did he withdraw it? Her eyes filled with tears. Because I left before the case finished. You disappeared, he said. I panicked, she said. I thought I could give Mason a simpler life. One where people didn't ask who his real father was. One where I didn't have to keep explaining everything. One where people didn't see a little boy with 2 dads and think it was strange. Carter stared at her. So you erased him. Her face crumpled. I didn't mean to. I didn't think he'd fight. I thought he'd move on. And now? She wiped her eyes. I don't know. I haven't spoken to him in 5 years. Carter stepped back. Mason's drawing now made perfect sense. He hadn't been inventing anything. He had remembered. Does he know where you are? Carter asked. No, she whispered. And then Carter asked the question he hadn't expected to feel so deeply. Does he know Mason still remembers him? Lila didn't answer. She didn't have to, because Carter already knew what he had to do. Carter didn't speak to Lila for the rest of that afternoon. He walked Mason to school like he always did, but his mind was far from the chatter of the 6-year-old beside him. Mason held his hand tightly, swinging their arms as they waited at the crosswalk. Carter? He asked, glancing up. Are you mad at Mommy? Carter stopped walking. He knelt. No, buddy, he said softly. I'm not mad at her. I just found out something I didn't know before. About Dom? Carter blinked. Yeah? About Dom? Mason looked down, toeing the pavement. I didn't think I was supposed to say his name anymore. Mommy used to get really quiet when I did. Carter rested his hand on the boy's shoulder. You can always say his name. Always. Mason's eyes lit up. He had this whistle he used to blow every time I fell asleep on the couch. Then I'd wake up and he'd say, Sleepy kid alert, report for pillow duty, and he'd carry me. Carter's throat burned. That sounds like a pretty good dad. He was, Mason whispered. They reached the school gate, and Mason ran off with a wave. Carter stood there a long time before returning to his office. He didn't go through his assistant. He didn't check his calendar. He closed the door, picked up the phone, and called Grant again. I need you to find someone else, he said. Name? Dominic Reyes, Denver. He would have been involved in a guardianship petition in 2018. Social work background. Grant didn't ask questions. Give me a few hours. Carter hung up and leaned back in his chair. His mind replayed every moment with Lila, the way she avoided questions about Mason's toddler years, the time she changed the subject when Carter asked how Mason had handled Caleb's death. There had always been a gap, but he had assumed it was just grief. Now he knew better. He wasn't angry. He was grieving the truth he thought they'd built their lives on. That evening, Lila was waiting for him at home. She sat on the edge of the couch, pale, her hands twisting a tissue into fraying threads. Did you find him? She asked. Carter didn't answer. He set his phone down on the coffee table. She exhaled shakily. I didn't mean to lie to you. You didn't lie, he said. You just omitted a father. Her voice cracked. I thought I was protecting Mason, and Maybe myself, too. You shouldn't have had to hide who helped raise your son, Carter said. You shouldn't have had to run from someone who loved him. I didn't know how to explain it. You don't have to explain anything to me, Carter said quietly. But you need to explain it to him. She blinked. You mean... I found him, Carter said. He lives in Austin now, still works with kids. Grant says he kept your old address listed in case you ever returned. Lila covered her mouth. He didn't stop looking, Carter said. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Oh, God. I want to meet him, Carter said. More importantly, Mason deserves to... Lila nodded, crumbling. The call was arranged the next morning. Dominic answered on the first ring. Hello? His voice was exactly how Carter imagined it, measured, warm, like someone who never raised it unless it was to comfort. Mr. Reyes, Carter said. My name is Carter Wynn. I think you once knew a boy named Mason. There was a long pause, and then quietly, Is he okay? He's okay, Carter said. But he remembers you. He drew a picture, and he called you one of his dads. The breath that came through the receiver was sharp, disbelieving. I'm engaged to Lila, Carter added. But I didn't know about you. She kept that part of her life private. I understand, Dominic said, his voice breaking. I've wondered for so long if he forgot me, if she erased me. He didn't, Carter said. He remembers everything. There was silence. Then Dominic whispered, Thank you. We'd like to see you, Carter said, if you're willing. That weekend they flew to Austin. Lila didn't sleep the night before. Mason bounced in his airplane seat, drawing another picture, this time of 3 stick-figure adults and 1 kid in the middle. He labeled them Mom, Carter, Dom, me. They arrived at a quiet neighborhood, modest homes, yards lined with wind chimes and planters. Dominic opened the door before they rang the bell. He looked older than in the file photo. Gray had touched his temples, but his eyes, those kind eyes Mason had drawn in blue, lit up the second he saw the boy. Mason, he said, barely audible. Mason stared for a long second, then broke into a run. Dom! He crashed into the man's arms, burying his face in his shoulder. Dominic wrapped him up, eyes brimming, whispering over and over. I missed you. I missed you. I missed you. Lila stood at the curb, frozen. Carter walked beside her, and she whispered, I didn't know if he'd hate me. He doesn't, Carter said. He's still the man you knew. She nodded slowly, then walked toward the porch. They spent the afternoon in Dominic's backyard. Mason kicked a soccer ball. Lila cried quietly when Dominic brought out a whistle from a drawer and blew it once, sharp, joyful. Sleepy kid alert, he called out. Mason laughed until he hiccuped. That night, in the hotel, Mason crawled into Carter's lap. Thank you for finding him, he said. Carter wrapped his arms around him. You already had 2 dads, Mason, he said. I'm just lucky to be one of them. And in that moment, Carter understood what kind of man he truly wanted to be. Not the kind who needed to be the only father, but the kind who could be proud to stand beside someone else and still be whole. They stayed in Austin for 3 more days. Each morning, Mason insisted on going back to Dominic's house. He remembered the backyard like it had never left him. He knew where the stepping stones led, where the cracked fence used to creak when the wind blew. He even found his old toy dump truck buried beneath a bush, mud-caked but intact. He held it up like a treasure. Dom said he kept all my things, Mason told Carter, running his fingers over the faded yellow plastic. Even my drawings. Want to see? Indeed, Dominic's home was filled with small remnants of Mason's early life. Crayon art on faded paper, toddler-sized sneakers in a memory box, a worn copy of Goodnight Moon with pages fraying at the edges. On the refrigerator door, beneath magnets from local diners and dog rescues, hung a photo of Dominic holding baby Mason in a pumpkin patch. It had never been a question. Dominic had loved him like a father. That night, Lila and Carter sat on the front porch while Mason slept curled on Dominic's couch, wrapped in a fleece blanket with cartoon whales on it, another relic Dominic had never thrown away. Lila sipped her tea slowly. "I thought if I ran far enough," she said, "the past would feel smaller." Carter looked out into the dark yard. "But it wasn't." She shook her head. "It was just waiting. Still real. Still full of all the love I tried to forget because I was scared." Carter turned to her. "Do you regret being with him?" "No," she said softly. "I regret leaving without letting him fight for what he already was." He reached for her hand. "Then don't run again." She looked at him. "You mean—" "I mean, let's figure this out. All of us. Together." She stared down at their hands, then nodded. "You're really okay sharing him?" "I'm not sharing him," Carter said. "We're building him. Together. Me, you, and Dom. He gets to have all of us." Lila smiled, tears in her eyes. "That's not how most men would handle this." "I'm not most men," he said gently, "and he's not most boys." The next morning, they sat Dominic down at the kitchen table. "Come back with us," Lila said, "to New York, just for a visit at first. But Mason, he needs you." Dominic blinked. "You're serious?" "I don't know what we are," Lila said, "but I know we're not done." Carter added, "We have a guest house. Use it. Stay as long as you need." Dominic stared at them, stunned. I thought I lost you both forever." Lila reached across the table. "You didn't. We're here, and we want you in his life." Tears rolled down Dominic's cheeks. "Thank you." Their return to New York made headlines, though not because of the reunion. It was because Carter Wynne, the famously private billionaire, made a public statement at a charity gala held 2 weeks later, flanked by Lila on one side and Dominic on the other, with Mason asleep in a chair behind them. "Family," Carter told the room, "doesn't always follow biology. Sometimes it follows choice. Sometimes it follows love. And sometimes, when you're lucky, it circles back to where it started and lets you do it right." People whispered. The media speculated. But Carter didn't care. He had what mattered. The mornings that followed were filled with new rhythms. Carter made Mason's breakfast. Dominic walked him to school on Tuesdays. Lila took Thursday movie nights. On weekends, all three of them showed up to soccer practice. Parents at the field stared at first, 2 men and a woman laughing, cheering for the same kid. But Mason didn't notice. Or maybe he did. But it never mattered. He had all the love he could carry. One afternoon, Mason ran across the lawn, his drawing folder in hand. "I made another one," he called out. They gathered around as he flipped it open. 3 stick figures stood side by side. Underneath, he had written, "My 3 parents. I'm the luckiest kid in the world." No one corrected him. No one tried to explain or define it differently, because Mason had drawn the truth. And this time, no one would fold it away. Autumn in New York turned the streets gold. Leaves drifted across the pavement, and the air smelled like roasted chestnuts and something older, something softer, like memory. It had been 2 months since Dominic moved into the guest house. He found work almost immediately. His reputation in social work was still strong, his references impeccable, and Carter had quietly made a call or two to ensure the hiring committee at a local youth center gave him a proper look. They had, and within a week, Dominic was leading outreach programs for at-risk kids in Brooklyn. He came home late most nights, always smelling like printer ink and cafeteria food, tired but smiling. Mason waited for him with new drawings nearly every evening. One night, Carter found them sitting on the floor of the living room, shoulder to shoulder, Mason explaining the details of each new stick figure illustration with the seriousness of an architect. "This is you," Mason told Dominic, pointing at a broad-chested figure with square glasses. "And this is Carter. He's holding the keys. You always carry snacks." Dominic laughed. "I'm okay being the snack carrier." Carter leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, watching them. His heart clenched at the sight, not with jealousy, but with something deeper. Gratitude, maybe, or grace. because somehow, impossibly, the picture had widened instead of breaking. Later that night, after Mason had gone to bed and Lila had stepped out for a walk, Carter and Dominic sat outside on the patio with a bottle of scotch between them. The silence stretched long, but not uncomfortable. "I thought it would be harder," Dominic said finally. "What would?" Carter asked. "This sharing?" Carter poured another finger of scotch. "I'm not sharing him. He's yours, he's mine, he's hers. That's not division. It's multiplication." Dominic exhaled. "I loved him like a father, I still do, but I thought I'd lost my right." "You didn't," Carter said. "You just got delayed." Dominic turned to him. "Why did you fight for me? You didn't have to. You had everything." Carter looked out at the quiet garden. "Because Mason drew you. That's all the permission I needed." They sat in silence again. Then Dominic said, "I'm not going anywhere." "I know. And if I ever make you feel like you don't belong—" "You won't," Carter interrupted. Dominic nodded slowly. "Still, thank you." Carter lifted his glass. "To the boy who made us both braver." They clinked glasses, drank. Inside, a new drawing sat on the kitchen counter. It was different this time. No stick figures, just a house, with 3 names written over the front door: Lila, Carter, Dom, and just below it, in bright orange crayon, Mason's home. That night, Lila found Carter in the kitchen, still staring at the drawing. "Do you think we'll ever have to explain this to the world?" she asked quietly. Carter turned to her. "I think the world will catch up, and if it doesn't, then we'll still be here," he said, pulling her close. "We'll still be us." Later, Mason woke from a dream and wandered down the hall. He found the 3 of them, his mom, Carter, and Dom, sitting on the couch, quietly talking. He climbed up, pressed himself between them, curled against Carter's side, and reached for Dominic's hand without even opening his eyes. Carter looked down, one arm around Mason's back. "You okay, buddy?" Mason nodded sleepily. "Just had a dream." "Good or bad?" Mason yawned. "We were in a spaceship. You and Dom were flying it. Mommy was the boss." They all smiled. "Sounds about right," Carter whispered. Mason mumbled, already drifting again. "I don't need to draw any more." "Why not?" Lila asked gently. "'Cause it's real now." He fell asleep in Carter's arms, and in that quiet moment, no announcements, no ceremonies, an unconventional family settled into something stronger than law or history or blood. They settled into truth, and love that refused to ask for permission. Winter came early that year. Snow dusted the city like powdered sugar, softening the sounds of traffic and carving new rhythms into their blended life. There were boots by the door now, 3 sets in small, medium, and large. There were gloves mismatched on hooks, and cocoa mugs with names written in permanent marker, and a chalkboard in the kitchen that read, "Dom's picking up Mason. Carter on laundry, Lila on dinner." It had started as a joke, assigning roles like they were cast in a play, but it became a system, a routine, a dance only the 3 of them could perform. Some days were messy. Lila forgot appointments. Carter lost patience. Dominic second-guessed himself. But in the quiet, in the undercurrent of everyday life, was something unshakable. A hum of understanding. A sense of respect that ran deeper than convenience or obligation. One Saturday afternoon, Mason's school hosted its annual Family Day. Parents were invited to visit the classroom, read stories, share photos, and talk about what made their families unique. Mason had spent all week preparing a presentation. Lila helped him cut out letters for the poster board. Dominic printed photos. Carter proofread the speech and bought 3 dozen cupcakes shaped like rockets. When they walked into the classroom together, hand in hand with Mason in the middle, the room fell silent for a beat. 3 adults, 1 child. The teacher, Ms. Kim, greeted them warmly, but Carter noticed the sideways glances, the parents leaning toward one another, whispering behind coffee cups. Dominic caught it too. Lila straightened her shoulders, but Mason didn't notice, or didn't care. He marched up to the front of the room with his glitter-covered poster and cleared his throat. "My name is Mason Arden," he began, "and this is my family." He pointed to a photo in the top left corner. Baby Mason on Dominic's shoulders, Lila smiling in the background. Then another. Carter holding Mason at a soccer game, both mid-laugh. And finally, all three adults and Mason at the breakfast table, each wearing paper crowns. "I used to think I had to pick," Mason said, "but now I know I don't. I have one mom and two dads, not because I was adopted, not because anyone made it that way, just because that's who loves me." There was silence in the room. Then quietly, Ms. Kim began to clap. A few more joined in. Then the whole room. Mason beamed. Later, while Carter helped pack up supplies, a father approached him. Crisp suit, silver cufflinks. The kind of man Carter might have met in a boardroom, not a kindergarten classroom. "You're one of his dads?" the man asked. "I am," Carter said. "And the other guy?" "Also his dad." The man nodded slowly, looking over at Dominic, who was helping Mason with his backpack. "Must be complicated." Carter met his gaze. "Only when we pretend it shouldn't be simple." The man blinked. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. "I get it. He's a lucky kid." Carter watched him walk away, and for the first time in months, he didn't feel like he had to explain anything. That night, back at the house, they curled on the couch with hot chocolate and Mason between them. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the lights from the Christmas tree blinked quietly in the corner. Lila leaned her head on Carter's shoulder. Dominic stretched out on the rug, Mason half asleep beside him. "I didn't know this could work," Lila whispered. Carter looked down at Mason, who was humming something under his breath. "It doesn't have to be perfect," he said. "It just has to be honest." Dominic stirred slightly, "and full of love." Mason murmured, without opening his eyes, "And snacks." They all laughed. And in that moment, warmth between them, snow falling outside, love stitched into every silence, they knew this wasn't the life any of them had expected. But it was, undeniably, the one they belonged to, and no drawing could capture it fully. Because some truths weren't made of lines, they were made of presence, of people who stayed, of hearts wide enough to make room for more than one name, and for a little boy who believed in all of them. Spring arrived in soft bursts of green. Trees unfurled like shy secrets. Buds broke open on every corner, and the city itself seemed to breathe deeper. The long chill of winter gave way to longer evenings, open windows, and the familiar rhythm of a family that had quietly rewritten itself. Carter found himself changing in small, irreversible ways. He no longer left for the office before sunrise. He paused when Mason asked questions, really paused, not just the polite tilt of a head. He read bedtime stories in funny voices. He helped with math homework he didn't understand, and when Mason got frustrated, he didn't solve the problems. He just stayed close. That had been Dominic's advice. "Sometimes," Dom said, "what kids need isn't answers, it's presence." Carter had never been taught that growing up. His parents were present in the way tycoons often were, at galas, in stock reports, in legacy projects, but not in the moments that shaped a child, not in dinner table talks or panic over forgotten science projects. Carter had always assumed that to lead was to control. Now he understood that leading in a family was different. It meant being soft where you used to be sharp, being still where you used to run. One afternoon, Mason came home from school holding a handmade book stapled together at the corners. "It's our family story," he said, climbing into Carter's lap. "We had to write about how our family started." Carter flipped open the first page. In crooked handwriting, it read, "Once there was a boy with a mom and a missing puzzle piece. Then a man came along and helped him find it. Then another man showed up and helped him hold it. And then the puzzle wasn't missing anymore." Carter blinked hard. Mason beamed. I didn't know how to draw 3 adults, so I just made the house really big instead. Lila joined them on the couch, resting her chin on Carter's shoulder. Dominic leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his smile quiet but proud. Later, Carter found himself standing in the guest house, now more of a second home. Dominic had moved some of his books onto shelves, placed framed photos of Mason around the space, and hung a small painting Mason had done for him on the wall. But the place still felt halfway. That night, over dinner, Carter put down his fork. I want you to move in, he said. Lila looked up. You mean into the main house? Carter nodded. Not as a guest. As part of this. Dominic froze. Are you sure? Carter met his gaze. I want Mason to feel like all his family lives under one roof. But it's your home, Dominic said gently. No, Carter said. It's ours. There was a long silence. Then Mason, between bites of spaghetti, said, I don't see what the big deal is. We already eat together. They all laughed. By summer, the move was complete. 3 adults, 1 child, 1 golden retriever they adopted on impulse, and a house that was finally, fully lived in. The place echoed with life. Socks in the hallway, Lego mines in the living room, half-drunk coffee mugs on the porch railing. On Father's Day, Mason woke early. He'd spent weeks working on his gift, a painting. When he handed it to them at breakfast, his face was solemn. The canvas showed a big tree with 3 trunks growing from the same root. At the base of the tree stood a boy, arms outstretched. Above him, painted in big block letters, I don't need to pick. I get to keep you all. There were no words, just 3 men, Carter, Dominic, and Mason's grandfather, who'd flown in to visit, staring at the canvas and blinking away tears, each touched in a place words never quite reach. That night, as Mason slept, Lila stood outside on the deck with Carter and Dominic. I used to think this would always feel like something I messed up, she said quietly, but now I look at him and at both of you, and I realize this is what healing looks like. Carter reached for her hand. Dominic reached for the other. They stood like that for a long time, listening to the sounds of summer. And in the hush of that evening, with the stars overhead and the windows of their home glowing behind them, they knew something unshakable. They were no longer just a patchwork of past choices. They were, at last, a family, built not in defiance of convention, but in devotion to love. And that love, once fractured by fear, was now made whole by the boy who had drawn the truth first, 1 crayon at a time. Autumn again. 3 years had passed since the drawing, since the note, since the quiet unraveling of secrets and the even quieter rebuilding of a new life, one made not from templates or tradition, but from truth and effort, and the stubborn, beautiful choice to love each other beyond the usual outlines. Mason was 9 now. He had longer legs, a sharper wit, and a knack for disarming adults with unfiltered honesty. He loved history books, science kits, and still always drawing. His notebooks were full of space stations and comic strips, cityscapes, and fantasy maps. But most often he drew houses, big ones, messy ones, sometimes shaped like trees or books or 3 hands linked at the center. Always homes, always full. Carter kept a box in his study filled with Mason's drawings. It was something he never showed anyone, not because he was hiding it, but because it felt sacred, a gallery of what mattered most. Dominic taught after-school workshops now, creativity and courage, he called them. He brought in speakers, ran art therapy sessions, and helped students tell their own stories. He used Mason's note in his curriculum sometimes, the original crayon drawing, scanned and printed in color. This, he would say, isn't just art. This is truth. And truth, when shared with love, makes space where it didn't exist before. Lila had published her first children's book that fall. It was titled The House That Love Drew. It was about a little boy who felt torn between people he loved, only to discover he didn't have to choose, that hearts could be shared, and homes could hold more than anyone expected. It was a quiet success. Teachers wrote letters, kids sent drawings, parents whispered thanks in her inbox. At the launch, Mason stood beside her at the podium. He wore a bow tie and sneakers and held her hand the whole time. "She wrote this for me," he told the room, "but I think she wrote it for a lot of other people, too." Later that night, when the house was still and the last guests had gone home, Lila stood at the kitchen sink washing mugs while Carter dried and Dominic packed leftovers. "Do you ever think we'll have to explain this to someone who doesn't understand?" she asked suddenly. "Maybe," Carter said. "Definitely," Dominic added. Mason's voice floated from the stairs. "I can do it if you want." They laughed. Mason came down, barefoot and pajama-clad, clutching a wrinkled piece of paper. "I started a new story," he said, holding it out. "It's about a kid with 3 parents, a pet dragon, and a house that flies." Carter knelt beside him. "Sounds amazing. What's the title?" Mason grinned. "The Sky Belongs to Families Too." Dominic blinked back a tear. Lila knelt down too. "Will you read it to us?" Mason beamed. "Only if you help me finish it." And so they did. They curled up on the couch, the 4 of them, under one blanket, reading aloud and scribbling notes in the margins. Each line more ridiculous than the last, each laugh louder, each page a new memory written into the walls of their home. Outside, the wind blew the leaves into golden swirls. Inside, love moved without needing labels. They were not a traditional family. They were something better, something truer, a blueprint drawn not by law or lineage or blood, but by the small, sure hands of a boy who had never asked for normal, only honest, only safe, only love. And in their house, on every page, every wall, every heart, he found it, over and over again. The first snow of the season fell softly on the city, blanketing the sidewalks in quiet. The lights in the windows of their home glowed warm and golden, casting halos against the glass. Inside, the air smelled like cinnamon and stories. It was the evening of Mason's 10th birthday. He had planned the whole day himself. Pancakes for breakfast, a visit to the Science Museum, pizza with extra cheese, and a homemade movie night where he got to direct and everyone had to act in his script. Carter wore a cape. Dominic wore a top hat and held a plastic sword. Lila, to Mason's glee, was cast as Commander of Snacks. The final scene, shot on a phone propped up by books, was of a family on a spaceship escaping a collapsing planet. They didn't leave because they were running away. They left because they were bringing hope to a new world, together. After the movie wrapped and Mason had taken his bow, they all curled up under a mountain of blankets in the living room, laughter still echoing in their chests. Carter handed Mason a small box, unwrapped, no bow. "This is from all of us," he said. Mason opened it carefully. Inside was a leather-bound sketchbook. The first page had already been filled in with a single sentence written in Lila's hand. "The world needs your stories. Fill this with truth." Below it in Carter's script, "You taught us how to draw family. Now draw everything else." And in Dominic's handwriting, "There's no wrong way to tell your heart." Mason stared at the page. He didn't speak at first, then he looked up, eyes shining. "Does this mean I'm a real artist now?" Lila pulled him close. "You always were." Dominic kissed the top of his head. "Now you just have a title," Carter smiled, "and a future." That night, after Mason had gone to sleep with the sketchbook clutched to his chest, the 3 of them stood outside on the porch, breath fogging in the cold. "He's going to grow up knowing how loved he is," Lila said, arms wrapped around herself. Carter pulled a blanket from the couch and draped it over her shoulders. "And how much love can look like." Dominic sipped from a mug, then said quietly, "You think someday he'll tell someone about us? Like really explain it?" Carter glanced at him. "You mean, will he have to?" Dominic nodded. Lila answered, "Maybe, but he'll know how, and he won't apologize." Carter reached for Dominic's shoulder, resting his hand there. "I used to think families had to follow a script," he said. "Now I think Mason's teaching us how to write new ones." They watched the snow fall in silence for a while. And then Carter added, "We should take a picture, all of us, something he can carry later." So they did. They set the phone on the railing, used the timer, and posed the way Mason always asked them to, Carter in the middle, Lila to his right, Dominic to his left, all their arms linked around each other's backs. In the morning, Mason found the photo printed and framed on the kitchen table. He didn't say anything at first, just stared, then picked up a crayon and added to the image 3 hearts above their heads, connected by a line that looped back to his name. One word underneath. Always. That photo stayed in the front hallway, long after Mason had grown taller than Carter, long after the first heartbreak and the first published comic book and the first time he left for college. It stayed. So did they. The house shifted with time. Walls were painted, rooms were repurposed, but the foundation never changed. 3 adults, 1 boy who became a man, and a truth drawn in crayon that no one ever needed to explain again. Love, when given without condition, remakes everything. Even families, especially them. Years passed the way pages turn in a book that matters, slow when you try to rush it, fast when you try to hold it still. Mason grew. He became sharper in wit, softer in speech. He held eye contact when others couldn't. He asked hard questions. He saw through posturing. He loved deeply. That was the through line from childhood. Mason loved with his whole self. He kept sketching, even when deadlines and friendships and the noise of growing up threatened to drown that quiet gift. He filled sketchbooks, dozens. Stacks of them lined his bedroom shelves, then later his dorm room at Columbia, then eventually the sunlit studio apartment he rented near Central Park. He called the 3 of them, Carter, Lila, and Dominic, every Sunday without fail. Some Sundays he just wanted to hear their voices. Some Sundays he asked for help. Sometimes they just sat in silence together on the phone, everyone reading or eating, content with each other's breathing on the line. His first published graphic novel, released at 23, was titled Homesick. It was a love letter to a childhood spent redefining the word family. One critic wrote, "Mason Arden has given us a tender, fierce vision of family that unbuttons the boundaries we inherited." Mason smiled when he read it. He didn't need validation, but it was nice to be seen. On the book's dedication page, he had written, "For my parents, Carter, Lila, and Dom. You gave me every kind of safe. You taught me that love isn't counted, it's kept." The book launch was modest. Mason never did well with crowds. But all 3 of them showed up. Carter wore a suit. Dominic wore jeans and a collared shirt. Lila wore earrings Mason had made from scraps of old pen caps when he was 10. People didn't question their place beside him, because everyone already understood. When Mason turned 30, he invited them to his apartment for dinner. He'd cooked, mostly. Dom brought dessert, Lila brought wine, and Carter, per usual, brought flowers no one asked for, but everyone appreciated. After dessert, Mason pulled a thick envelope from the bookshelf and handed it to them. "What's this?" Lila asked. Mason smiled. "Just open it." Inside were illustrations, dozens of them, a new story about a boy who was raised by 3 people, a soft-spoken teacher, a brilliant business person, and a mom who made magic out of food and love. A story told in panels, ink and color. Quiet conversations, messy days, laughter in the margins. The last page was a mirror, a drawing of a mirror, really. In it, the grown version of the boy stood, surrounded by 3 adults, all older now. Their hands rested on his shoulders. Above it, the words, "I was never missing a piece. I was built with all of them." Carter had to walk into the kitchen to collect himself. Dominic wept openly. Lila touched Mason's face and whispered, "Thank you for remembering us exactly as we were." "You made it easy," Mason said. That night before they left, Carter pulled Mason aside. "You've made something incredible," he said. "I had a blueprint," Mason replied. "No," Carter said. "You made the blueprint." He held Mason for a long moment. Then they walked out into the cold, their breaths visible in the night air, their arms around one another. There was no need for more words. They had all been said, lived, drawn, remembered, because once upon a time a little boy drew a picture of two dads and a truth no one had expected. And from that drawing, a life was built, a real one, the kind where love didn't choose sides. It built bridges and held them open, forever. Mason was 40 when he stood behind the podium, the lights of the auditorium warm against his collar, the crowd murmuring quietly in the dim before he spoke. He wore a simple gray blazer, dark jeans, and sneakers. He never liked dressing up too much. It felt like playing someone else. Tonight wasn't about performance. It was about truth. The plaque on the podium read, "National Book Award Ceremony." His most recent work, The Architecture of Love, had just won for Outstanding Narrative Nonfiction. A hybrid memoir and illustrated journey, it chronicled the evolution of his family through shifting perspectives. His mother's silences, Dominic's steady devotion, Carter's unlikely tenderness. He'd used their real names with their blessing. They'd cried the day he gave them early copies. Now he looked out at the sea of faces, some strangers, some lifelong friends, and the three people who shaped him most, all seated in the front row. Carter's hair had gone white at the temples, but he sat straight-backed, hands clasped over his knee, beaming with quiet pride. Dominic wore his reading glasses pushed back on his head, fingers twitching like he wanted to sketch every moment. Lila had her arm around both of them. Mason cleared his throat. "When I was a kid," he began, "I drew a picture, just crayons and copy paper, a house, a kid, and two dads." A soft chuckle rippled through the audience. I didn't think it would become a conversation, or a question, or a moment that changed everything, but it did, because when I handed that picture to Carter, he didn't laugh. He didn't ask me to explain. He just read it. And later, he gave me the greatest gift an adult can offer a child. He acted on it. Mason paused, steadying his voice. He went looking for a man he'd never met, just because my drawing said he existed. He didn't ask if it made him less of a father. He didn't worry about whether he'd be replaced. He just honored the truth a child gave him. The room was silent. And in doing that, Mason said, he helped build a family that wasn't perfect but was whole. He gestured to the front row. My three parents gave me a home, not by law or blood, but by showing up, day after day, with snacks and scoldings, with laughter and repairs, with presence. We didn't need to explain it. We just needed to live it. A woman in the second row wiped her eyes. "I wrote this book," Mason said, "because I want more kids to know their stories matter, even before the adults catch up. I want them to know that drawing two dads or two moms, or no parents at all, doesn't make them wrong. It makes them real. It makes them worth listening to." The crowd stood before he could finish the last line. He stepped away from the podium, eyes glassy, and walked down the stairs toward the three people waiting for him. Lila reached for his hand. Dominic pulled him in for a tight hug. Carter simply whispered, "You did good, kid." Later, as the reception buzzed around them, Mason watched his parents huddle together on a couch, laughing over old photos someone had pulled up on a phone. He heard them correcting each other's stories, adding forgotten details, exaggerating punchlines. He felt his chest fill with something enormous and tender. He stepped out onto the balcony for air, the city shimmering around him. A small girl, no older than 8, followed him out. She held a program under one arm and a pen in her hand. "Are you Mason?" she asked. "I am. My teacher read us your book, the one with the house that has 3 doors." He smiled. "Yeah? I wrote my own story after that. I have 2 moms and 1 uncle who lives with us. He's not like with them, but he's my favorite, so I put him in it. I bet it's a great story." "It's weird," she said. but it's mine." He knelt, took her pen, and signed the program with a flourish. "There," he said, "now it's official." The girl grinned and ran back inside. Mason turned back to the city and whispered, "Thank you," not to anyone specific, but to the moment maybe, to the memory, to the little boy who had once drawn what he thought might be wrong and had instead found everything that was right, because stories like his weren't rare. They were just waiting for someone to read them, and someone else to believe them. Still, Mason was 62 when the museum exhibit opened. It was called Drawn to Love, the legacy of a crayon family, set in the heart of the city's Children's History and Culture Museum. The exhibit spanned 3 rooms. The first featured Mason's original drawings, scanned, reprinted, and framed. Crayon scrawls, wobbly stick figures, rainbows that never stayed inside the lines. A timeline unfolded beneath them. Mason at 6, at 10, at 16, each drawing annotated with quotes from his journals and interviews. The second room held artifacts from the years that followed. The original copy of The House That Love Drew, Lila's first edition, with the publisher's handwritten note in the margin. One of Dominic's early curriculum guides for his youth storytelling course. Carter's framed Wall Street Journal op-ed titled, "Why I Stepped Back from the Table to Sit Closer at Home." And at the center of the third room, under a soft, protective light, sat a single framed picture. Mason's crayon drawing of 3 stick figures and a house. Below it, a plaque. In 2016, Mason Arden handed this picture to his soon-to-be stepfather, unknowingly changing the course of 4 lives and redefining what family could mean. He didn't explain it. He didn't apologize for it. He simply drew the truth. Visitors came from everywhere. Couples, teachers, social workers, grown children who once handed over drawings of their own. They cried in the corners. They wrote messages on the Add Your Story wall. They brought their kids back with them to say, "Look, see this? This is how big love can be." On the final wall of the exhibit, Mason had included a new quote. "I used to think I'd made my family different. Now I know I made it honest. Families aren't drawn by rules. They're drawn by love. And sometimes it takes a child with crayons to remind us where the lines should really go." That night, after the exhibit's opening gala, Mason sat alone in the final room after the guests had left. The security guard had nodded him in. No one stopped him. It was, in many ways, his home, too. He stared at that first drawing. The paper edges had faded, but the emotion was still bright. Behind him, footsteps approached. He didn't turn. "I thought you'd still be here," came Dominic's voice, rougher with age, but still kind. "I wanted to see it alone." "You okay?" Mason nodded. I'm thinking about the version of me who drew that." "He'd be proud." Mason turned. Lila stood beside Carter now, all 3 of them grayer, slower, but smiling like nothing had changed. Because it hadn't. Not in the ways that mattered. "I was scared when I drew that picture," Mason admitted. "Scared it would make things weird, that it wasn't allowed." Carter stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. And now that picture made room for the world. Lila wrapped her arms around him. They stood together in front of the drawing. A mother, 2 fathers, and a son who had given them all permission to be exactly what they were meant to be. Together. Without correction. Without compromise. Without apology. And somewhere in the quiet, in the hum of memory and museum lights, Mason felt something more than pride. He felt peace. Because the story that began in crayons had not just grown up. It had grown out, across time, across hearts, across the walls of tradition. It had built a house, and made a home, one that still had room for anyone brave enough to draw the truth. In Mason's final years, the world slowed down just enough for him to sit inside it. He spent his mornings in the sunroom of the small lake house he had moved into with Lila after her retirement. A quiet place with wide windows and water that glistened like breath. Dominic lived next door. Carter visited every Sunday. They no longer needed to talk about how their family had come to be. They simply lived it. The world had changed, too, in small, meaningful ways. Schools taught emotional architecture courses based in part on Dominic's early work. Mason's books were part of public curriculums. Carter's foundation, which he had named Bridges, Not Walls, had grown into one of the largest privately funded networks supporting alternative family models, youth advocacy, and safe home infrastructure. But none of them clung to legacy. Legacy wasn't what you left behind. It was what kept breathing after you did. One fall afternoon, a letter arrived at the lake house. It was handwritten in green ink on thick stationery. Mason opened it slowly, his hands a little shakier now, and read the first line aloud. "Dear Mr. Arden, I don't know if you remember me, but I visited your museum when I was 8. I was the girl who told you she had 2 moms and an uncle who wasn't technically family, but still her favorite. You told me that my family sounded like the start of a really great book." He smiled. The letter continued. "I'm 19 now, studying art therapy. I'm writing my own book, and I'm drawing my truth because you showed me how. Thank you for helping kids like me see that there's no wrong shape for a home. And thank you for never erasing anyone from yours. With love, C. Torres." Mason folded the letter, pressed it to his chest, and exhaled. He didn't need awards anymore. He had letters like this. Proof that the crayon drawing he'd made as a child had not been the final word. It had been the first line. That night, Carter and Dominic joined them for dinner. No occasion, just tradition. Lila cooked, Dominic brought stories from the youth center, and Carter brought pie and argued about how it should be cut. After the plates were cleared and the last logs crackled low in the fireplace, Mason sat in his favorite chair and looked at them all. His voice was quiet but clear. "I'm not afraid of what comes next." No one needed him to explain. Dominic reached for his hand. Lila sat beside him, head against his shoulder. Carter knelt by his side and simply whispered, "You gave us everything." Mason smiled. "You let me." In the weeks that followed, he wrote when he could. Short entries, observations, letters to no one in particular. His final entry was 3 lines long. "My family never fit a mold. It made one. Love isn't perfect, it's present." Mason passed away in early spring, just as the dogwoods bloomed. At his celebration of life, they didn't play somber music. They played Mason's favorite film scores, displayed his childhood drawings across long tables, and handed out little boxes of crayons to every guest. People came from everywhere: students, colleagues, readers, children now grown. Some had known him, others had only read him, but all had felt him. Lila gave the eulogy. "He taught us how to draw love where others told us not to," she said, and then he invited us in. Dominic and Carter stood beside her, hands clasped, and together they placed Mason's final sketchbook into a glass case that would join the exhibit in the museum's Hall of Living Truths. The last page was simple: a house, 3 adults, a child grown, and beneath it, "You never outgrow the home you help build." The day after the memorial, a little girl visited the museum. She had 2 dads and a birth mom who lived across the city. She stared at Mason's final drawing for a long time. Then she sat at the Draw Your Truth table and picked up a green crayon. She drew a boat with 4 people inside, and beneath it she wrote, "We float because we don't have to fit." The docent framed it that same day, and just like that, Mason's story began again, in a new color, with new lines, still true, still growing, still making room. The museum held an annual celebration on what would have been Mason's birthday. Not a memorial, not a gala, they called it Draw the Day. Families, educators, and children gathered in open courtyards, at long tables under banners that read, "Draw your truth, share your shape, define your home." There were no rules, just paper, crayons, and quiet bravery. That year, On what would have been Mason's 72nd birthday, Lila returned for the first time in a decade. Her hands were thinner now. Her once black curls had softened into silver, gathered into a loose bun. She walked with a cane she refused to call necessary, and she carried a small envelope she hadn't opened in over 40 years. She had found it while cleaning out Carter's attic the year before, months after he passed. It was labeled in Mason's handwriting. Open on a day you need to remember why it all mattered. That morning, she decided it was time. She sat at a small table beneath a maple tree and unfolded the letter. Mom, if you're reading this, I'm not here. Or maybe I am, just not how I used to be. I want you to know I always knew it was hard. I always saw you trying to balance everything, to give me something soft in a world that expected everything to be sharp. You did it. I'm not just talking about Carter or Dom or our kitchen or the quiet way you always knew what I needed before I did. I'm talking about the permission you gave me, by accident maybe, or maybe on purpose, to love big. I saw you forgive yourself in pieces. I saw you learn to trust more than one person. I saw you cry in closets when you thought I couldn't hear. But you were never small. You were the first place I felt safe. And every room we built after that was a version of you. If someone asks how it all worked, just tell them. My son drew the truth, and we let it stay on the wall. Mr. Lila pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes. A child approached her table. 7, maybe 8, she held up her drawing. 4 people inside a circle with one hand reaching in from outside. I didn't know where to put my birth mom, the girl whispered. I don't live with her, but I think about her. Lila smiled. Then you already found the perfect place. The girl beamed and walked away. Later that day, Dominic joined her. His steps were slower now too, but his smile was the same. You opened it, he said softly. She nodded. I didn't cry as much as I thought I would. That's because he gave us so many words while he was here. And pictures, she added. So many pictures. They sat in silence for a while, watching children scribble lines that might become legacies. I've been thinking, Dominic said, about creating a new archive. She raised a brow. Another one? An open one, where every family, no matter the shape, can submit their child's first drawing of home. We call it The Wall. Digital and physical, traveling, interactive. Let the world see what kids think love looks like before anyone tells them it's wrong. Lila looked out over the crowd and nodded. He would have loved that. He drew it in a way. We're just catching up. That evening, the two of them sat on the museum steps after the celebration had ended. A janitor walked past, holding a box of drawings kids had left behind. One fluttered loose and landed near their feet. Lila bent to pick it up. A crayon drawing of a starship. 5 stick figures. Above it, the words, "My family flies better when we don't all try to be the pilot." She held it up to Dominic. Another truth, she said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a pen. On the back of the drawing he wrote, Mason's Wall, Exhibit 001. The janitor watched, confused but smiling. And just like that, the next chapter of Mason's legacy began. Not with ceremony, not with speeches, but with a piece of paper, and someone willing to read it. Still, the exhibit launched 1 year later. They called it Mason's Wall, just like Dominic had written on the back of that first found drawing. The name wasn't fancy. It didn't need to be. It traveled across cities and countries, expanding with each stop, made up of the drawings of children who had defined family in their own terms, with crayons, pencils, torn notebook paper, tablet screens, scraps from the margins of homework. No drawing was turned away. Every submission was displayed. There were houses with 2 moms, tree houses with no parents, just grandparents and pets, spaceships with a dad and an older sister at the controls, castles with guardians who were teachers or neighbors or cousins. Some drawings had no figures at all, just colors and light and open space labeled home. When the exhibit opened in Seoul, an 8-year-old boy handed a curator his sketch and said, "I want to be the first one who drew a home that floats." His picture was of a hot air balloon filled with books and quiet. A note beneath it read, "My mom said love should lift you, so I built mine like this." When Mason's wall arrived in Rome, a child in foster care drew a winding road made of puzzle pieces. It had no destination, just a path. Underneath, she wrote, "I haven't found it yet, but I believe I will." The exhibit didn't just invite families to look, it invited them to draw. Each location had its own on-site station, a long table with fresh paper and a banner above it that read, "This is what love looks like to me." Each table had 3 chairs, one for a child, one for a parent, and one left open for whoever else needed to join. That was the rule. There had to be one open seat. By the end of its first world tour, Mason's Wall had over 50,000 submissions and had been seen by over 4 million visitors. But it wasn't just the art that made it powerful. It was what came after. A quiet trend began to ripple. Schools began hanging truth walls in hallways. Pediatricians added drawing corners to their lobbies. Social workers began asking children to draw their safest space as part of their intake. Governments took note. New family services were formed, informed by the themes in the drawings: connection, freedom, listening, permission. Not one child had drawn money, status, or conventional pedigree as part of what made a family. They drew arms, smiles, warmth. One little girl who had never met her birth parents but had lived with the same foster family for 5 years drew a giant nest with feathers in every color. In bold letters she wrote, "I wasn't born here, but I fit here." That sketch was later etched into the entryway of a family court building in Chicago, where judges now began their days walking past it. Lila, now in her late 80s, toured the exhibit one last time in Paris. A volunteer recognized her and asked if she'd like to add a drawing of her own. She smiled and picked up a pencil. She didn't draw figures. She drew an open door. No handle, no lock. Just light pouring through it into a home you couldn't yet see. Then she wrote, "I walked through his drawing, and I never walked back out." The volunteer wept when she saw it. That drawing became the final panel in the traveling version of Mason's Wall, the one every visitor saw before they left. And on the back of the panel, a single sentence from Mason's final interview, now engraved in 5 languages. "Every family is born when someone decides to stay." That was the legacy, not one of fame, but of presence, and of a picture, a single page, drawn by a boy who believed what he saw and loved what he remembered, and handed it over to a man willing to look. Still. Years later, long after the last stop of Mason's Wall, the world had changed in ways no one could have predicted because of technology, policy, and the natural evolution of generations. But in the quieter corners of that change, where systems often overlook and hearts are still learning to heal, Mason's truth endured, not just in museums or classrooms or family court corridors. It lived in stories, in language, in the everyday, in homes where children grew up with 3 toothbrushes in the holder and didn't need to explain why, in hospitals where emergency forms allowed more than 2 guardians without hesitation, in schools where teachers asked not "Who are your parents?" but "Who's your circle?" It lived in the words of therapists who now asked kids to draw their support systems instead of listing them, in the policies of companies that granted leave to non-traditional caretakers, in Sunday dinners where no one blinked when the introductions came with phrases like, "He's my mom's ex-husband, but still my dad." And it lived in the lives of thousands of people who had at one point sat in front of a blank sheet of paper and drawn their truth. It was no longer rare. It was understood. There came a day when a little boy named Sam, only 5 years old, visited his first art museum with his moms and his godfather. He wandered away briefly and found himself staring up at a framed drawing that looked simple, just crayon, stick figures, a house. He tilted his head. "I draw like that," he said. A docent nearby smiled. "That's Mason's drawing." "Who's Mason?" The docent paused, then crouched to his height. "He's the boy who helped the world learn that love doesn't fit in a box. It's drawn in." Sam nodded seriously. "I think I'm like him." "I think you are too." Later, Sam found a Draw Your Truth station tucked into a side room. He sat down with a red crayon and began to draw. He made a circle. Inside it were 3 people and a dog. He wrote, "My family is made of warm food and singing," and below that, "You don't have to pick, you can keep." The museum framed it, placed it beside Mason's original drawing. No plaque, no glass case, just 2 truths side by side. One that changed everything, and one that proved it stayed changed. Carter once said that Mason gave them everything, but the truth was more radical. He gave it to all of us, and somewhere, right now, someone is folding a piece of paper with crayon on it. Somewhere, right now, someone else is unfolding it and reading. Still. In a quiet town nestled between 2 mountain ranges, far from the cities where Mason's story had first spread, a small community center sat beside a library. It had no grand architecture, no plaque out front. But inside, a room was dedicated to something extraordinary. They called it the Crayon Room. The walls were made of chalkboard paint, and every surface, walls, floors, tables, was filled with drawings. There were no rules about color, no lines to stay inside, just a bin of crayons and a single instruction written above the entrance: "Draw your truth. It belongs here." A retired teacher named Mrs. Etta ran the room. She had silver braids and glasses that perched on the tip of her nose. Every week she printed 1 copy of The House That Love Drew and set it out for a new visitor. The book never stayed long. One day a boy named Ari came in with his foster sister, Jen. They didn't talk much. They just grabbed crayons and started drawing. Ari drew a tree with 2 nests and a rope bridge connecting them. Jen drew a family sitting in a circle with the word "safe" repeated underneath. They stayed for hours. Mrs. Etta gave them apple slices and let them speak only when they were ready. At the end of the day, Ari approached her with his drawing. "Can this go on the wall?" He meant the rotating display on the far end of the room, the place where the most powerful drawings lived for a time before being archived and replaced. She looked at his picture. "It sure can." He whispered, "Mason would have liked it." "You know about Mason?" He nodded. "My first foster mom read me his story, said it helped her understand why I call 2 people Dad." Etta smiled and pinned the drawing beside Jen's. Later that evening she opened the archive log. Drawing, narrate 215, artist, Ari, age 9, title, The Bridge. Caption, "My dads live in different nests, but I get to go back and forth, and neither of them makes me feel wrong for it." She wrote it carefully. Each entry mattered. The archive had grown exponentially over the years. No longer just a traveling exhibit, it was now a permanent global project. Schools, shelters, libraries, even embassies contributed to the digital collection. Every child who added to it was sent a thank you letter with a scanned copy of Mason's original drawing and a handwritten note from the curators. "Your truth belongs here too. Keep drawing. Keep being brave." In Mason's hometown, a statue now stood in the courtyard of the Nora Lane Children's Museum. It wasn't a statue of Mason. It was a sculpture of 3 hands, adult hands, holding up a blank piece of paper. A sign nearby read, "Every great change begins when someone chooses to read what a child dares to draw." Mason never wanted a statue of himself. He once said, "If they ever make anything with my name on it, make sure it has space for someone else's." So the Crayon Room became a movement. It spread, not just to cities, to refugee camps, to group homes, to hospitals. to detention centers, places where children still whispered their truths into corners, and every time a new child picked up a crayon and drew something they weren't sure would be accepted, a home that floated, a family made of 4 grandmas and a neighbor, a single parent and a best friend, they were joining a story that had never ended, and never would. Somewhere, a teacher explains Mason's story. Somewhere, a judge reconsiders custody through the lens of belonging instead of biology. Somewhere, a child whispers, "That looks like my life," and suddenly feels less alone. Somewhere, still, the paper is folded. Still, the drawing is passed. Still, the truth is read. Still,